So we're back for potentially one last time for our final thoughts on the game. I guess if I had to give a short impression of the game overall, would I play this again? I think the answer is yes. Would I 100% the game again? Probably no. I don't think some of the quests were really worth doing. We're listening to the soundtrack as we do the review. I think the soundtrack was solid. It's a short game, but pretty neat. It's one of those things I could recommend. If it goes on sale, I would recommend checking it out if you're interested in a game like Castlevania with movement, sort of like, as they said in the Kickstarter, Mega Man X. We definitely saw some inspiration from both games, including things like backdashes, just some of the look and feel, like grabbing the ledges. Feels a little Mega Man in some points. But I think that would be my short impression of the game. So I guess we could describe the game as a whole and walk through thoughts and feelings of the game in a more in-depth, mostly spoiler-free portion before we talk about more spoilers. So this game, as the name indicates, is about time. The whole gimmick, pretty much within 10 minutes, you're given the ability to manipulate time, and you can use that to pause boss attacks and get behind them. You can't damage things while in time stop, so you do have to unpause things. I did like how this game utilized the time stop for freezing enemies in place. I thought that was pretty cool. And instead of having traditional weapons, like in a Castlevania you might have rapiers, hammers, axes, etc., etc., we have orbs, and those orbs are interchangeable. You eventually get the ability to swap into different equipment sets, which was pretty good. Surprised they didn't give you a rewind power. I could kind of see it. Yeah, they didn't go too far into the time powers. It's mostly just when our time powers enhance, that improve like the story time travel, but not like actual combat time travel. And overall, the game is pretty fast-paced. I would say, for the most part, it's definitely on the easier end. I think we had only one challenging portion of the game, like genuinely was like I had to use items in a non-boss fight. And that's because I accidentally did something out of order, and I realized after the fact that I went an area ahead of where I was supposed to go. There's a decent number of hidden walls. I think exploration is fairly fun. There's backtracking once you get enhanced jumps and things of that nature. And I think overall it felt good to control the game. I would say my only complaint from like the movement standpoint would probably be backdash. It's like they knew you could chain it in games like Soten, so if you try to do like backdash canceling, it doesn't really work well. So even if you attack out of the dash, you don't immediately get to dash again, which it did make it feel a little clunky. And honestly, we barely even used that mechanic after like maybe a quarter of the way through the game, because it just didn't feel worth it for the most part. There were a couple enemies where it seemed like it should have been more useful, but due to the fact that you couldn't chain it, it meant that enemies that leaped at you, for example, could reach you. So while it did force you to do certain mechanics like crouching or maybe time stopping in order to get past them, I would say backdash was probably the worst movement option in the game. I was a little confused why some movement options were locked into very, very late in the game, like literally like true ending only, but whatever. It is what it is. It does have me very interested in the randomizer for the game to see some of those lesser used movement options, including the optional spells, for example, actually play a bigger role in the randomizer, because there seemed to be more than one way to get vertical height, more than one way to get horizontal distance with your jumps. So I definitely look forward to trying that again in the future, given that I like the base game quite a bit. We played on normal. We have the option to play New Game Plus and Nightmare. We'll see, maybe. We'll maybe take a look in a future stream. But I would say from the standpoint, it was about as long as the game should have been. I don't think it really overstayed its welcome with the combat. It got a little confusing at one point. Some of it was on me, and I could definitely see another point where people would have been very confused. In particular, going into the past and needing a specific orb to do something. I feel like people probably got stuck at that, if I had to guess. I think for the most part, the interface is fairly clean. I think things just made sense as we went through it. We had a nice journal to keep track of quests, to keep track of documents. None of it like super mandatory for the game. I will say the quest rewards were actually surprisingly good as we got further along. So we unlocked more mechanics for getting new spells, which is something we could charge, and then we can attack during, as we found out later in the game. Wish I knew that earlier. We can also forge new passive abilities for ourselves. So we kind of have like an equipment menu that spans both the weapons, the spells, and a passive. But then you have your traditional equipment slots like your helmet, your armor, your legs, etc., etc. And those, it was kind of a nice blend. I don't think it was like overly complicated. I think it made sense for what it was. We didn't use a whole bunch of the different orbs. I know it wanted us to kind of rotate through them to get through damage resistance, but honestly, that's where we kind of get into some of the balancing issues of the game. It is really easy for the most part. Like, if you're just playing through and doing all the quests, we ended up like heinously overleveled doing one of the quests. If we were to speedrun the game, I could see it being a lot harder. We'd probably be like 10 or 15 levels lower, aka having like 100 to 200 less health and less damage and less defense. But levels in this game scale you very quickly. Like, the difference between 2 or 3 levels is kind of insane, especially with the rate of fire that you have on most attacks. Like, for example, there was a wind orb that basically is a short-range blast in basically a straight line, and it could be used as quick as you could press the button, as far as I could tell. So any kind of damage scaling abilities kind of broke the game with that one. And we didn't really need to use any of the quest-specific orbs or any of the late-game orbs. Like, we could have used them. We don't need to. So, there's that. I think from the standpoint, the story, I like the core story. I like the idea of time traveling. I will try not to go into too many spoilers here, but I like the idea of zipping between 2 different points in time and affecting dungeons and other plot events, and I'll leave it as generic as possible as that. I will say, though, the quest dialogue, it felt really awkward. I'm not gonna lie. Like, there was definitely some shoehorned in themes and agendas. And, like, while I'm all for the promotion of, like, the LGBT plus community, it was really unnatural dialogue. Like, I would not believe anybody in their mind would be saying half of the things that they started to say. Like, when it was more about, like, the invasion or saving their lover, it's kind of like, yeah, that makes sense. It doesn't really matter who their lover is. You could see it. It makes sense. But man, oh man, in particular, that super awkward sleepover quest thing, whatever you want to call it, that was a choice of dialogue. That was an event that happened in a game we played. So, kind of mixed there. Yeah, it's like, I did like that they were inclusive, don't get me wrong. I think for some of the characters it made sense. I liked it being shown as like a difference between them, and it's very strong, like, class system, like anti-class is a big theme throughout the game, in particular with the people you meet in the past. But yeah, some of that dialogue was just really awkward. It's just like, I don't think people would talk like this, even in general. I don't know. It felt very weird. And it's strange because I think the other dialogue in the game, including in the journals, felt more natural and still had similar themes. Like when you were looking at, like, the confession letters or them yearning to go back to the other planet, for example. Like, I felt like that was fine, but just some of the quests were just kind of like, I'm shaking my head. This is just awkward. So, probably would not read through the story again for the most part. I did like the main story. Some of the quests were fine. I kind of like that this is probably the only game that didn't have an atrocious escort mission. I'll give it that. It made sense for what it was. It was nice to do it in an area that was very easy on purpose. So it was nice to see, I suppose. I don't think if there's anything I can really talk about without going into spoilers beyond that. Like, that's about as spoiler-free as I could get it. So overall, I would say, you know, music's solid. I'm not going to go out and listen to it, I think, on my own. Like, I won't approach this like I would, like, the Kessen soundtrack or a Suikoden soundtrack, where there's, like, that standalone song I would listen to in a playlist. But I think it suited the atmosphere pretty well. So it's not to say the music is bad, it's just not for me, for the most part. Like, this kind of music makes sense. It's no Peruti, it's true. It's true, it's no Peruti. No awful bwah songs. Yeah, I don't think there was necessarily a bad song we heard. I think the loops of the soundtrack were fine in-game. But at the same time, I don't think there was like that moment where the music really made the moment for me, where it like really elevated the scene. It was just kind of like mostly mood music, is the best way I would phrase it. It's not something I would just listen to normally. I prefer more action-oriented or villain songs, and the villain song in this game was okay. Just, it is pretty forgettable. Yeah, like, it definitely fits the environment, so I think the game is better for it to have it, but I'm not exactly rushing to get the soundtrack at the same time. So I think from the standpoint of non-spoilers, I can't think of anything to talk about. I think the controls were mostly tight, managed backdash, which felt awkward. We talked briefly about spells. I guess I didn't mention you hold the spell button down. So it gave us something to do when we were dodging bosses. So if the boss forced us out of range of our mostly short-range attacks, we at least could then punish them with the big damage move. So that felt pretty good, actually, to keep tempo. And I don't think any boss patterns in this game were too crazy. I would say, like, maybe the true final boss was the only one that had a kind of, like, surprising pattern where you had to react very quickly. The others could generally be cheesed by time stop magic, and I don't think you really need to try very hard on most of those bosses. So hopefully we'll see how hard they are without time stop in a randomizer or something like that. But in a good way. I don't want them to be like, you know, end game boss, no time stop kind of thing, but it'd be nice to see some of the early bosses without time stop. So yeah, there's a lot of mechanics in the game. We didn't really use them a lot. There were a lot of consumable items, like your classic Castlevania of healing potions, MPs, and sand or the time power restore. We basically used nothing the whole game, to be honest with you. The only time we really used items, quote unquote, is mostly for the fetch quests, which again, if I were to play again, I probably would never do them again. It's like, it's just okay. And if we New Game Plus potentially and start with our orbs, then I have no reason to do the quest again. But I think from the standpoint of the non-spoilers, there's nothing else I can think of. So chat, if you want to leave any thoughts, feel free to spoil. I think I'm going to talk about spoilers in just a moment. We're going to talk about moments we thought were most memorable in the game and maybe some things we felt could have used improvement. But in a way that there's no way to talk about them without spoiling. So I would say, going into the spoiler territories, I like that most of the characters between the past and the present, between like the destroyed present and the past, I like that they kind of had connections to each other, not only from like relationship standpoint, but it's nice to see the world warp and evolve as you dealt with the political figures. So it was nice to see, for example, when you defeat Queen Alenia, her statues disappear and such in different places. It was kind of interesting to see stuff update in the present as you defeated the plot bosses. And I think it was a very interesting mechanic where, you know, you saw vines overgrown in the present and you burned them down in the past. I definitely think those were the strong suits of the game. The game was pretty light in puzzles in general. So that I'm happy, because I'm not into puzzles, like pretty much at all, as chat knows. So it kept it pretty light, and I think I could, you know, I could get through it, and I think it was very thematic and on point. There were only a couple areas that I think kind of annoyed me, and it's not because they were hard, it's just more that it stopped you from just moving to deal with the problem. So, like, to give you an example, when we were in the, I forgot his name already, but the mad scientist lab with all the biotech horrors, I felt like those stupid wall crawling eyes that shot lasers were like such a bad enemy design. I feel like I know what they were going for, but it's just like when they stick to the ceiling and then they can also just move themselves into a corner, you don't have like a lot of things that could really deal with those. Yeah, like you had like a couple of orbs and we ended up using a spell over the orbs, but it just ground the playthrough to a halt every time we had to go through one of those rooms because it basically emitted a solid laser the whole time. There was no downtime. And it would damage boost you backwards, so you couldn't just like damage boost through it either. So when we were kind of done with the game and we were just exploring some side areas, I felt like that was kind of tedious. And I think that's my only real complaint about the enemies. I feel like most of them had like fair gimmicks to them, like Sniper Snipe, You know, you had your guards with the shields. You had the big hulking monsters that had a big wind up for their attack. So like all things you could react to even if you hadn't seen them before. Status ailments were pretty frequent throughout the game. I think the only one that was kind of annoying was chaos in rooms where you needed to time stop to platform, and magic down in rooms where you needed to create your own platforms. Those didn't feel good, but they're not like game ruiners by any stretch of the imagination. I think from the standpoint of the different endings, I was kind of disappointed in the endings. I mean, some of them were literally like, what, Chad, maybe 2 cutscenes apart? It's not quite as bad as the Kessen 2 true ending. Don't get me wrong. We've seen worse this year from different kinds of games. But yeah, it's just like when you're choosing between whether or not to go in the past or present or to kill, you know, the big bad emperor that caused all these issues, it just felt like there wasn't really a reward. Like, it gave you an item for doing it, but it just like, it didn't really give you like a really meaningful change. It's like, oh yeah, so this, and this still happens, but this happens instead, or this happens in addition. And that's it. Like, the 3 endings we saw pretty much back to back were literally those cutscenes were the same ones as the other ones, and we skipped through the dialogue. Like, when she goes back to the village, for example, it's kind of like, whatever. Yeah, I thought it was going to be much more impactful, but it just... It changed, like, what, maybe 4 to 6 sentences worth? And maybe it would cut a cutscene out of the ending. That's about it. So not the best in terms of endings, but it is mostly like a Castlevania game, and you don't usually play Castlevania for its riveting story or endings. I do find it kind of confusing that they were comparing it to Star Ocean in the Kickstarter, because we looked at the Kickstarter while we were sitting through those ridiculous credits. Chat can agree, those credits actually did get ridiculous. They started out nice and spaced apart. You're like, oh, it's like a small team, so it must be like an indie game, as a confirmation to what we thought earlier, with people backing for their portraits and stuff, because we kind of noticed that, you know, we didn't know the history of the game going into it, but we kind of noticed like, oh, okay, something's going on. Is this an indie game? Is this a Kickstarter? And we confirmed that in the credits. But man, oh man, just those credits went on for an eternity. I'm glad you could skip it once we saw through it. I mean, I'm glad it had that much support, don't get me wrong, but yeah, it's just like, wow, that was a wall of text. So we didn't see anything at the end of the credits. Spoilers there. Everything was pre-credits. Is there anything else worth talking in the spoiler section that I think would make or break the game? I mean, I guess I like the references to the Eternal Mother. I'm kind of sad we missed one of them in the normal playthrough. We only found it when we missed documents. I thought that was kind of neat to kind of see it referenced. Even in one of the endings, it references the Eternal Mother. Before we find out what that means. But I think from the standpoint of spoilers, level design is mostly fine. We're in a decent amount of secrets. I don't think there were any, like, truly terribly made levels. So I have to say, from, like, a standpoint of, like, replayability, like, whether you're going up a mage tower, or the lake, or going in the mines, I think most of them felt pretty fun to kind of move through. So again, if we're just looking for something to randomize it on the same scale of, like, the Castlevania games we play, it seemed mostly fun. So I'm looking forward to that in the future. So overall, I'm still left with a good impression of the game. It took us, like, what was it, a little under 9 hours reading out loud all the dialogue, which is always going to slow down the gameplay, and also getting lost very briefly for, like, 10 minutes or so. So I would say reasonably 8.5 hour, 8 hour game for 100%, because we got every ending by 8 hours. So we would end every tile in the map without a guide. So definitely not a very long game, but it's nice. So who knows, maybe we'll revisit New Game Plus, or we'll try to see where those other achievements are in game. So we did get most of the achievements, but not all of them. Some of them seem kind of grindy. I guess that's my other complaint. The merchants were there. I think the merchant to get armor was somewhat useful, but I felt like the crow merchant was mostly useless. I mean, like, he gave us something that increases luck that makes the other quests less tedious, but I don't remember him giving us, like, a, Oh wow, this is a game changer at any point in the game. So imagine if you were a backer, you probably got more things out of him than a normal person would, but I can't really confirm without looking into more details and doing research. It just felt like he was there. Like people had chosen him as a mascot, and that was what we had kind of figured out as we played the game. But he didn't really impact the gameplay in any single way. And who knows, maybe that means I missed something. As I said before, we 100%ed the map, but it's possible there's something else we could have done to get more. So who knows? But I think from that standpoint, chat, I don't really have too much else to say about the game. I think overall, positive impressions. Would recommend the play. Story was, Main story was fine. Quests were like, they were just run-of-the-mill, go find eel meat or whatever nonsense they're asking for. So, yeah, I don't think I have anything else to say. So, I guess if chat has any final thoughts for the game itself, that will be all for now. So, I guess stick around, chat, after this. We'll have a brief discussion on what's coming up next in the pipeline. But I think from YouTube, that is our final thoughts. I don't have anything else to really say about the game. Yeah, I think we covered everything. It's not a very long game. We beat it in 2 sessions. Honestly, if we didn't do the quests, it'd probably be only like 4 to 6 hours, maybe less if you speedrun. Like, it's definitely not a long game by any stretch of the imagination. Anyway, we're gonna say so long to YouTube. I'm not gonna say this is the end of Timespinner, but I will say this is the end of our playthrough. But that doesn't mean we can't do future playthroughs. So, for now, I'm gonna say thank you for watching, YouTube. Hope you join us again next time with the new game.